Thank you very much. And it's very nice to have English as an official language, so my incomprehensible Swedish doesn't disturb the communication. And of course, as a computational neuroscientist, I really love the logo of this festival. I really like brains and computers, and together they're even more awesome. So I'm the kind of unruly researcher that drives professors nuts, because I can't keep to one topic, which is why I ended up in philosophy, because there I can get away with almost anything. Previously, when I was sitting in my office in Stockholm, my professor could look in and say, Anders, there is no brain on your computer, you're slacking off, you're not working. Now it can be anything. Economics, brains, asteroids, and anything about the history of Sumerian civilization and what that can tell us about city planning. And it's all philosophy. So that's another tip. If you want to slack off or work very hard, go into philosophy. And I'm trying to think about the big picture, because if there is one thing philosophy is actually good at, it is at thinking about those areas where we have no clue what we're doing. If you're an engineer, you want to have the data, you want to know how to put things together, and then you're creative with that and build something useful. If you don't have the data, well, if you're a scientist, you're happy, because then you can go out and get the data, and if you can figure out how the data fits together into a bigger picture, you can get a Nobel Prize. But if there is no real data, no easy way of getting it, and no good rules for the domain, at that point most scientists says, I'm not going to get into that mess. Meanwhile, the philosophers will say, oh, no data. That's really curious. Have you ever thought about what that lack of data means? And of course, as soon as the philosophers then get the hang of what's going on, we immediately declare, that's a wonderful topic here, have its own research department with lots of funding. And then we get something like the natural sciences, history, psychology, sociology, economics. And then we all wonder why the philosophers never seem to achieve anything. Yeah. So I'm in that messy part of the world. And I'm interested in the future. I'm interested in what is it going to be like? And one of the interesting problems is that we're very bad at thinking about the future. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're bad at thinking about the future and why this is linking very much to innovation and entrepreneurship. So once upon a time, the future was actually very simple. Well, in the past, and the present and the future all looked the same. You would be farming. Sometimes exciting things like starvation and a bit of plague happened. Occasionally a king shifted or there was a war, actually quite a lot of wars, but deep down there was no difference. Past and present and future was all the same, and saying that things could be very different didn't belong in that realm of thinking we normally do. Yes, you can hear about it in church that one day the world will end, but that's kind of something you hear on Sundays. That's a big, scary, interesting, fascinating picture, but most of the days you were farming. And then something changed, not too long ago. Progress. We invented progress. And many of us today cannot even imagine living in a world where progress didn't exist, where the idea that things will be different in the future, generally much better. So in the Middle Ages, progress didn't really exist. In the Renaissance, people said, oh yes, there was a golden age during the ancient Greek world. They had it all together, and then we've forgotten most of the cool and important stuff, but we can at least recover some of it. A few hundred years later, people started realizing, hey, this new stuff is very different, and it's actually way better than what Aristotle and the other Greeks ever heard about. That Isaac Newton guy, his physics is really powerful, changing our understanding of everything. We can build new devices that the ancient Greek didn't have. They couldn't even think about them. Whoa! And gradually we got this new idea that, we can learn more about nature, we can control nature, we can get a lot of wonderful, awesome stuff. And of course, in general, this was measured in terms of bigger, better, faster, stronger. A lot of the classical ideas of progress was very much like everything will become streamlined and fly. The flying car, that's kind of the ultimate example of progress. And we have been doing amazingly well with this. Those farmers in the Middle Ages were not particularly effective. Partially because we didn't have tractors, partially because the seeds they were using were actually not that good. So when people started to seriously breeding better forms of crops, they got amazingly much better. This is about soybeans, and this shows the American production as we gradually invented better and better ways of making soybeans more effective. That green dot at the end is the best thing you can do at a research lab where they do everything perfectly. This is an amazing amount of progress if you compare to how much you could make back in the old days. And this has, of course, helped us immensely. We have more food than ever. Of course, that also led to more people. For a long time, every advance humanity did led to a little bit more food, which led to more people who ate the food. And then everybody were about the same in terms of poverty, but there were a bit more people. Now we're starting to take off here. Back at the early days of Industrial Revolution, actually people got better off and didn't just become more people to take up the resources. We're actually getting wealthier faster than we grow as a population. Which of course also feeds our visions of the future can be even better. Of course, we have a little problem. The future turns out to be somewhat tricky. The old view of progress turned out to be not just that we got environmental problems or that we started worrying about the oil running out, but also that the world got rather weird. Think about it. Right now, the euro is in a bit of trouble. Meanwhile, a completely digital currency, not backed by any nation, which is just backed actually by mathematics and a bit of software, is, if not becoming better than the euro, at least it's starting to become a contender as a currency. And then we have various weird knockoffs and versions of it. Anybody can invent a new digital currency in an afternoon. We have developed self-replicating machines. They are software, but yes, they can replicate, they can make copies. We have created life. And this life is being used mostly to send spam. Spam is an enormous annoyance. So we have software filters using really advanced text recognition algorithms, Bayesian filtering, a lot of very clever machine learning in order to get rid of the spam sent by the self-replicating machines. Most of us are carrying around a piece of electronics which corresponds to a supercomputer in power, and we're using that to take selfies. Or, for that matter, use this awesome internet to make cat memes. Again, when people started thinking about the internet, they were thinking about something that would be useful for the American military, a communications network that was hard to disrupt. And many of the people involved also realized, hey, it's actually quite powerful to connect computers together. This might be a really big deal. What happened then was we invented new uses for this, uses that were completely incomprehensible to the originators. Well, many of them are around, so they of course have learned to enjoy cat memes, but we have found entirely new uses for this technology. Similarly for the computer, Alan Turing would probably have been rather surprised that his idea of a Turing machine, originally developed just to prove certain mathematical facts about how to do computation, could not just be turned into a computer. He was pretty confident about that, but that it would be used to send pictures of cats. And in fact, that it would become so enormously powerful, and that his Turing test that he proposed as a way of proving that, yes, there might be machines that could think, is right now used to fight the spam. Because we're having reverse Turing tests in form of CAPTCHAs, where you prove that you're a human by solving a problem that so far we think computers are bad at. And we're losing. We humans are actually rather bad at solving these little image problems, while the spammers are getting rather good at solving them. It might be that we're getting artificial intelligence thanks to the computer viruses and spams. So we have ended up in a slightly weird place here. And the old view that we have progress, we're getting more better and faster and stronger of everything, doesn't seem to be quite true. What is happening is that we're getting a different future. A future that is actually quite unpredictable. And in many ways, this is, of course, how it has always been. In the Middle Ages, if they were to envision the world of 2015, first of all, they would say, hey, haven't Jesus returned yet? That would be the first surprise. But otherwise, we say, well, there would be farming, and there would be kings, and everything would be working like it has always done. If you go back to the Victorian era, they would be talking about the amazing zeppelins we would be running around, or maybe going into space using probably cannon-driven rockets or something like that. Again, the problem is that when we think about the future, quite often we just scale up our present future. But the real future is when you mix things in unexpected ways. These Kyrgyz goat herders are using smartphones, not just to take pictures of photographers annoying them, but they're actually using them to watch movies. Because cell phone coverage up in Kyrgyzstan is apparently pretty bad in most places. However, when you go home, you can of course download some nice movies and watch that while herding your goats. They're actually part of this enormous globalized network. Not always when we're out there on the steppes, but they are participating just as much as you and me. Maybe some of them will be downloading stuff from this conference. We don't know. They might be tweeting at this very moment and commenting how I'm insensitive to the goat herders' needs. And if they aren't yet, they might do that in the future because it's also getting stored. So I'm going to talk a bit about how weird and different the future might become. And in general, of course, talking about the future typically means that you make a fool out of yourself. You can make a good living from it. And most people take the future about seriously as other forms of entertainment. You invite a futurist to your corporate seminar, and he says something cool, and you all feel, wisdom, we're having forethought, we're thinking about the future, we're thinking about what might happen. We are very wise people. And then, of course, nobody ever changes anything, because it was a nice seminar and even nicer dinner afterwards, and then we drank so much wine we forgot all about it. And nobody, the futurist included, doesn't really care about it. Of course, sometimes you do care about the future. If you're trying to do investment, you try to estimate your curves, you try to figure out how much return on investment will I get, how much risk is there here. But that's treated in a very different way from thinking about the future. The future is very different from the kind of future where we think about planning for where we want to retire, where we want to save our money, or what will happen to my garden next summer. There is an enormous difference between near mode, where we're actually pretty good at predicting at least some things, like that I'm a lousy gardener, I better hire a gardener if I want to have a garden with any living thing in it. Or that maybe I should ask somebody who knows something about money to put my money into a good savings fund. And I even can recognize that there are some people who are better or worse at it. Meanwhile, if I want to know about the world in 10,000 years, it's not clear that you should go to Oxford University or this lady. How can we tell who actually knows something? And in general, our past predictions have been pretty bad. So one big area of research we are doing at our institute is actually thinking about what areas can you say something sensible about the future? What areas can we be pretty certain that, yeah, crystal balls are about as good as computer simulations? And quite often the interesting question is not so much the prediction, but well, what about the uncertainty? What decisions can we make here and now based on those uncertainties, those possibilities? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these factors. So one of the classic approaches is, of course, to look at trends. This feels so reassuring. You take a lot of data, and typically you plot it on a graph, and you connect it with a nice line or a smooth curve, and then you assume it's going to continue. Remember those pictures about progress. This is very much the traditional idea of progress. Of course, you might add an exponential curve if you're really optimistic, or some logistic curve that levels off if you're a bit more pessimistic. If you're really a doomsayer, you of course want to have something that goes down. Now, the nice thing is that this has held true for a very long time. If we look at world population, it has grown roughly exponentially and now slacks off a little bit. If we look at how much wealth we have as a species, it has grown exponentially at an amazingly steady pace, about 2% per year, over many thousands of years. Think about that. If I were to show you some trend and said, this has lasted for several thousands of years, you would say that must be some kind of geological trend, rather than something going on in human society. And people have invented new ways of trading, new things to trade, new forms of economics, and suffered wars and devastations and falls of civilization and plagues And they haven't actually budged this big exponential very much. If you actually plot it, you need to squint in order to see the Black Death. And the fall of the Roman Empire hardly shows up. This is kind of stable, and that means that we should expect it to remain for a long while. Not necessarily forever, as I will get to, but we should expect the future to be way wealthier than we are right now. And we might hope, of course, that we use this more wisely. Again, have wisdom increased? Well, you can go back and read ancient text and realize that, yeah, people were rather stupid back then too. We don't seem to become that much wiser as a species, but we do become somewhat better. Steven Pinker has famously argued that we actually are becoming way more peaceful. If you actually look at how many people are getting killed in violence inside societies, you find that it has been dropping quite strongly over historical times. And one reason might be that we have better police, we have better society, we have found better ways of resolving conflicts, whether that is through law and punishment and the legal apparatus, or better ways of teaching norms so kids behave themselves, or even reputations. If I make a fool of myself right now, it's going to be recorded and going to be on YouTube until the end of time. My reputation is going to be affected by that for a long while. It's one thing if it's something slightly embarrassing, and another thing if I commit a crime right here in front of the cameras. That's going to be very hard to deal with. Once upon a time I could have fled to New Zealand and hoped that nobody would know me there, but now of course they will just Google me. So there is interesting things happening here as a side effect of what's going on in the computers. As a futurist, of course, I'm contractually obliged to always have some picture of Moore's law in any talk I give about the future. Otherwise, it's not about the future. And the important thing is not really how many transistors you can get into a microchip. That was what Moore originally suggested the law. But how many computations you can do per second per dollar. So the blue dots here are real data, and then I tried the various random statistical things, assuming even a very pessimistic leveling off, and it turns out that we're kind of 99% certain that we're going to get at least 100,000 times more computation per dollar per second. And that's kind of the most pessimistic view. The optimistic one, I have actually no idea how to even express. The interesting thing is also that we have changed the rules. For a long time it was, we wanted more computation and, well, electricity is cheap. But gradually we realized, electricity turns into heat. And heat tends to be bad for the chips and very hard to cool off. So what happened was, a few years ago, we stopped increasing the clock frequency, because that actually heated up the chips quite a lot. Instead, we started making them more parallel, and the end result is that they're more energy efficient. There is something called Coulomb's law, which is about how much energy it takes to do a computation. And it's been keeping step with Moore's law almost perfectly. The total amount of computation has, and energy used for computation has kind of been balancing each other. My microprocessor is becoming twice as powerful and twice as energy efficient. It's just that we're getting many more microprocessors, so we need more electricity for them. And of course, there is an interesting question, will this law just continue, or are we getting very green and this might be speeding up? Because we might realize that actually it would be very convenient to have super energy efficient processors. Similarly, another thing we care about is our own health and lifespans. And this has also been increasing pretty nicely. So this is a plot of the lifespan in the nation in the world that has the longest lifespan at the point in time. Norway is showing up there in a whole bunch of places. Right now, Scandinavia is getting beaten by Japan, but well, it's a nice competition. And the countries that are not at the top are generally rather close to it. The horizontal lines here are predictions made by experts about when it will stop. Because obviously we cannot just live forever because we have better health care, right? There is something built into us that eventually limits our health span. So people have been making these predictions at different points in time, and they have not held up. Experts are really bad at predicting the limits of human lifespan. We know there are some biological limits, just like we can say that, yeah, obviously there's a finite amount of oil in the Earth's crust, or a finite amount of computations you can do before your computer implodes into a black hole. But those limits are rather high. And the interesting thing is, of course, that this has totally changed our view on how society works. Because once upon a time, very few people actually survived until they could retire. And now we're almost becoming, not a minority, but a very sizable minority that is quite important. And we're changing the shape of what a human life means. Because right now, being a teenager until you're 35 is actually a rational choice. Both because you can't afford to find a flat, but also importantly, because you need to explore in order to find your way in this complex world. And then you probably need to change career a few times because the job you had will have disappeared by the point you're old enough. Again, this is just a trend, and that is already creating weird things. But trends can also break in fun ways. This is one of my favorite graphs. This shows the amount of money you make per capita in America, and this is how much energy you use per person. And from the Second World War up until 1970, you had this perfect straight line. Any economist would say, yeah, well, if you want to become richer, you need to use more energy. It's kind of a linear relationship. It's totally obvious. And then the oil crisis hit. And what happened was the curve turned a bit wiggly, but it turns just horizontal. The Americans are getting richer, but we're not essentially using that much more energy per person. That was a very surprisingly quick turnaround. Just a bit of a shock that, somebody can turn off our oil. And people started to become more energy efficient. We changed the underlying rules. And similarly, people have been joking about the number of blades on razors. And if you plot them and extrapolate, either we will have just a power law expansion, so by the year 2100 we have 14, or we're going to have an infinite amount of blades within 20 years. The funniest thing is when I was looking at this graph, a friend showed up with his razor that had 6 blades and a battery. I have still no clue why it needs to have a battery. But I'm not certain this is progress. It's just changing the rules in an interesting way. Why are these trends breaking? Well, in this case, the underlying dynamics changes. We want something different. Sometimes trends can also be because something else passes something in efficiency. So this is the chess rating of a computer running on a PC versus the best human. And what happens is it's kind of increasing linearly. And at this point, a PC becomes better than a human. And if you calculate this as a probability of the computer beating the human, which you can easily do, you see that, okay, at the start of the 80s, the grandmaster, they didn't need to worry about computers. And at the end of the decade, yeah, they were regularly beating. This linear change led to a rather drastic difference. Gary Kasparov, who is really good, he was beaten a bit earlier than this would predict, simply because IBM also threw a lot of extra computing power at the job. More is sometimes very different. And this can sometimes lead to a phase transition. So right now, I think we're living in this exciting and frightening transition to a transparent world. Remember those Kyrgyz goat herders? Up until recently, what we didn't spread very far. And it was rather hard to find out things that was going on. Now, thanks to ubiquitous computers, ubiquitous surveillance, drones, and that everybody has a smartphone and really loves taking selfies, which means that you have the pictures not just of yourself, but everybody behind you on Facebook, and we have better and better facial recognition, means that the world is actually becoming very transparent. And this is a bit of a phase transition, a bit like mist is lifting. It turns out that the opaqueness of mist depends on the size of the water droplets. It scales roughly with the 6th power of their size. This has the effect that when water droplets are small enough, they're transparent. You just have moisture in the air. Above a certain size, the air becomes very misty and opaque. But as mist dries up, you can suddenly see much further. Which of course leads to interesting effect, because it's not just that we see further in this room, but across the world. In societies that previously had rather traditional media landscape, suddenly everybody can see everything, which might make some rather turbulent effects in some of the more closed society who desperately try to manage this transition. And of course, sometimes we want privacy. Sometimes we get rather horrified by being embarrassed on the internet forever. So we try to safeguard it. Much of this privacy conversation we're having globally right now are a result of this. It's also interesting to notice that in 10 years, I think this picture is going to be regarded as rather obsolete. One reason is, of course, a smart glass device. Google is probably not going to market their wearable as Google Glass. But also, why should we not socially stream? Right now, this is regarded as problematic because we're having this transition but into a different view of privacy and public space. But that might change. So, similarly, we have this transition where our software is getting smarter. More is, again, different when you can actually put Wikipedia to work and win Jeopardy using that. I'm not going to get into the big and interesting debate about could we actually get self-improving technology. Because, after all, if we humans try to automate human tasks, and one human task is making machines. So could we make a machine that is better at making machines? And most of us software people know that actually our compilers are doing an awful lot of work already. And some of them are optimizing in interesting ways. They're not right now inventing new codes or new applications, but we're helping ourselves more and more. It might be not so much that a little computer under somebody's desk one day wakes up, I think, therefore I am, and now I need to take over the internet to think better. But that we as a society become better at improving ourselves so things take off very rapidly. That would be a very drastic phase transition. Very hard to tell whether that is going to happen or not. It's a very active area of research for us. But we want to change how things work. This wonderful and complicated graph shows the flows of energy that is eventually turned into services like transport, energy, computation, light. And if we want to do well here, we want, of course, to optimize this and improve it. I think one of the original headings when there was not new energy, but it was kind of into the brain, into the mind, and out of energy. And I think we are worrying about our energy use, or at least we want to move to other ones. And if we can improve some of these links, or make them self-improving, we can win enormous things. Because in the end, we're reshaping the world, and we better get good at that. So that leads to my final point. Evolution is a fundamental and innovative process. You can't predict where it's going because it tries a lot of different things. Some of these things are good ideas and spread. Others are dead end and disappear. Humans are doing this at an enormous rate. A lot of our ideas, of course, never get out of our head because we realize, well, wait a minute, that's a stupid idea. But quite often, we invent something, we try it, and it might work out. We are improving our own brains. I'm happy to chat more about that. And we are going to test it on ourselves. And again, many of these improvements might be improvements or actually pretty stupid things to try. But it's a good thing that people are trying them. We don't know whether there are beautiful magnetic fields. My friend Todd is kind of exploring that thing right now through his magnetic sense. And some people are expressing themselves in dramatic ways. Sometimes that's just good because it freaks the mundanes. But in here, there might be the new Apple computer somewhere, the innovation in brains that actually helps us do amazing things. Because the future is enormously big. I'm also happy to, in the breaks, to talk about just how awesomely big it is. And this universe doesn't look like it's that many aliens out there. Practically none, as far as we can tell. We actually have the stars to win, if we survive. That's why we better get off the planet. We better innovate better ways of living long enough to get off the planet. We also need to figure out what we need to figure out. And all of these are fundamentally unpredictable things, because if I could tell you what we need to figure out, we would already have figured it out. So I'm asking you to figure it out instead. Thank you.